If there was like sort of one thing you wanted to share with everyone about your research, what would that be?
I think invasive species is a really important global change issue because it has major effects on biodiversity. And so in my research at Binghamton University, we are interested in a couple of different aspects of understanding invasive species. One is what makes a species invasive.
Mm-hmm.
So why, when you take a species and you move it out of its native range, does it become invasive when it's not invasive in its native range? And secondly, what are the impacts of invasive species on natural systems? And the third thing we're really interested then is what do we do? So how do we best manage invasive species or try to eliminate invasive species to reduce their impacts on native ecosystems?
Yeah. Um, you know, I think sort of the idea of like why a species becomes invasive, like that's a really interesting question, and maybe you can't answer it in just a few minutes, but would you like to try?
Sure. It is a complicated question. And it's not the same for all invasive species, of course. But there are some, after sort of studying invasive species for a long time, there are some important mechanisms or processes that seem to be at play. One is just simply a species becomes invasive if it's moved a lot to a certain area. So we call this like introduction effort. So for example, the Great Lakes is a really heavily invaded ecosystem because a lot of organisms are brought there through shipping. So they're moved a lot, and that makes them do really well and occur in sort of high abundances in their invaded range. So that's one major one. The second one is that they're really moved out of their native ecosystem where they have sort of co-evolved with other organisms that might keep them in check. So one example is anything that kills another organism, right? So a predator or a herbivore or a pathogen, often would keep another organism in check. And if a species is taken out of their native range and moved into a new area, maybe those other organisms don't move with it. So that they might like lose their predators, or they may not be introduced with that pathogen. And so in that sort of novel environment without those organisms to keep them in check, a species might do well because it's sort of released from that top-down control. And that is another major reason why a species becomes invasive, or a species that's moved into a new region may become invasive or occur at higher abundances than it does in its native range.